So this presentation I put together originally a little over a year ago, and it is largely based on the exhibit that I wrote for the Creation Museum by the same title, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, which is in the process of being nearly doubled in size, which the original one is a temporary exhibit. We call it a mobile exhibit. It's not one that you can like pack up and take anywhere you want and then set it up for a week and then do it again. It's not that kind of thing. But once we're finished with it, we could actually sell it to to an organization or to it. If the church was large enough that they could actually have a foyer that would put it in there, they could do that, and we could duplicate the same thing. It would take some time because the baby models that you're going to see pictures of would take several months for a couple of artists to be working on. But everything else is kind of already prepped. All we have to do is reorder it. But the one we're working on now is a permanent exhibit that's going to be at the Creation Museum and be double the size. So it's been really a privilege to be working on it. And it was probably the exhibit, well, clearly it was the exhibit I was most nervous about writing. Not because I didn't know the right position. I believe wholeheartedly I had the right position on this based on Scripture. But because what approach, what level of sensitivity to approach this at. And I had some people, I remember a woman coming up to me that I worked with, she's not there any longer, saying, you have to make sure that you're very, very sensitive to this, that you don't want to make women who might have gone through this, even who have chosen to have an abortion, but make sure that they don't feel bad, that kind of thing. I thought, that's not the right approach. But then I had somebody else on the other side who said, you got to make sure these women know they're murdering their babies. I'm like, okay, that's not the right approach either. And so where is the right approach? It's somewhere in there. Yes, those things, we want to be sensitive to the person who has struggled in this area, or maybe has failed in this area. We do want people to be convicted by what's going on, but it's not by us bashing them over the head with it. It's by us teaching the truth. And so what we decided early on, I'm glad the leadership was on board with it, was that this exhibit is going to be a celebration of life. It's not going to be an anti-abortion exhibit in the sense of you walk in there and it's all about, look at how horrible this is, and let's positively share our case. So that by the time you get 2/3 of the way through the exhibit, you encounter a sign about abortion, the debate's already over. And then we'll talk about that. So let's get into the topic, what is abortion? Well, generally speaking, the termination of a pregnancy prior to delivery is technically an abortion from a medical standpoint. So an involuntary, spontaneous abortion, we usually call that a miscarriage. Okay? But in technical terminology, that is still involuntary, spontaneous abortion. So it still gets the same term because that pregnancy is stopped, it's aborted before the baby was carried full term. A voluntary termination of pregnancy is called an induced abortion. When I use the term abortion for this whole presentation, we're talking about that. Okay, that's the way we speak about it. So when I want to make sure we're very clear up front, because sometimes people play little word games, and oh, you're against abortion, right? Yeah. Oh, so you're saying it's sinful when a woman has a miscarriage? No, stop playing games. We're obviously talking about the second one. All right, and I'm just making that very clear at the beginning when I say voluntary procedure, and maybe sometimes forced, especially like a teenage girl or something like that. Maybe parents will force them to go down to the clinic and do that. So a lot of this, obviously this is something that's gone on in other countries. In the United States, where it really kicked off full swing, it had been going on in some cases and in some states. But on January 22nd, 1973, Roe versus Wade, which we've all heard about a lot in the news in the last month. Norma McCorvey, who was known as Jane Roe, versus Henry Wade, who was the local district attorney in Texas. She was backed by the ACLU and others to sue for the right to have an abortion, and ultimately went to the Supreme Court, and they decided in her favor on a 7-2 decision that there is a right to privacy in the 14th Amendment, as part of the due process clause. Here's what it says: nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. From there, they found the right to abortion. Not to deprive any person of life. That means you have the right to an abortion, which is depriving somebody of life. But that's what they ruled on a 7-2 basis. It essentially struck down any law in the land against abortion, the states that banned abortion at the time. But it did allow for restrictions depending on the trimester. So they arbitrarily set these different ranges: first trimester, second trimester, third trimester. By the way, if you walk through the exhibit at the Creation Museum, one word you will not see in the exhibit anywhere is trimester. Because it's just an arbitrary thing. I mean, it can be helpful for a pregnant woman to know, okay, I'm a third of the way through, or 2/3 of the way through, but there's no, well, my child is more alive now than he or she was a month ago, or one trimester ago. I mean, none of that. So we didn't want to even give a nod to this sort of terminology. So the Supreme Court did back in 1973, which was the year I was born, by the way. So I was born at the very end of that year. I could have legally been aborted. I would have been among the first in the nation if my mom had decided to do that. Thankfully, she didn't, and she never would have. But first trimester, no restrictions. So the states were not allowed in any way, shape, or form to put restrictions on abortion in the first trimester. The second trimester, they could reasonably regulate them. In the third trimester, they could prohibit abortion unless the mother's life was in danger. So that's what Roe v. Wade essentially did. That's why what you've seen up until last month, a lot of the states were, a lot of the more conservative states were challenging the second trimester area. They were trying to put restrictions in the second trimester because the states could reasonably regulate it. So they would make laws about how the clinics that are performing abortion have to have admitting privileges at a local hospital. In case something goes wrong, they have to be able to rush the woman to the emergency room and everything rather than just let her die at the clinic. And so that's where you saw a lot of the battle going on in the last, a lot of the legal battle going on over the last 40-some years, was over that second trimester. So between January 22nd of 1973 and January of last year, more than 62.5 million babies have been legally killed through abortion. Actually, that number, not the number, but the date, January 2021, that should be adjusted to June of this year. So 62.5 million babies were legally aborted. And up until 2016, the rate had been decreasing. It was just under 1 million a year in the United States for many years now. Although in the last couple of years that they kept track of things, from like 2017 and 18, it declined back up a little bit. And in many cases, the figures don't include the so-called morning after pills and everything, which are also a form of abortion. They do not prevent somebody they do not prevent the egg from being fertilized. It takes the life of that child after the fertilization. So then, last month, we had Life Day, June 24th, 2022. A momentous decision. The Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade by a 5-4 decision. Now, it was confusing. I thought it was 6-3 because I kept seeing people say 6-3, and then I kept looking in, and certain places would say 5-4. What it was is the Dobbs-Jackson case that went to the Supreme Court, Mississippi case, that led to this overturning of Roe v. Wade. The court decided that one 6-3, and then when it came to overturning Roe v. Wade, Chief Justice John Roberts flipped on that. He was the reason there's 4. So he did not vote to overturn Roe v. Wade, but he did side with the majority in the Dobbs versus Jackson case. So Roe v. Wade was overturned by a 5-4 margin. Maybe didn't see that reported correctly. There were a lot of outlets that were doing it incorrectly. So I was confused until I dug in. So nearly 63 million babies were legally killed in the U.S. during that time period. The court acknowledged that the Constitution does not include a right to an abortion. Thus, the matter belongs to the individual states, because that's what the Constitution lays out. It's not covered in the Constitution. It become the matter for the states. And so what you had back in 1973 was essentially judicial activism, making a law when that should have been something the legislature should have been doing. So the abortion debate has reshaped American politics. I think we understand that. Abortion may be the most sacred doctrine of leftist politics, and we have seen that in the last few weeks, haven't we? There are people who are extremely upset about Roe v. Wade being overturned. Many politicians, many activists. And one thing that really saddened me were the number of Christians on Facebook who were really upset about it. That surprised me. Many of them that I knew who would give, I'm going to call them sob stories, that maybe isn't a fair thing to do, but somebody who worked in an OBGYN and saw how difficult it was for some mothers, and that changed her view from being pro-life to in favor of what she called pro-choice. Okay, even if your whole argument is about what about in the life of the mother, like if the mother's life is truly endangered, if that's your argument, why are you on the side of abortion on demand for any reason, any time? If anything else, you should be advocating for, okay, in the instance of where the mother's life truly is endangered, then it should be allowed. That's what you should be arguing for, not, and which, by the way, would be less than 1% of all the abortions. So you don't use the extreme case to justify every single thing. And yet that's what a lot of people end up doing, and that's really pretty sad. So the media, you know this, they generally use very slanted labels. It's pro-choice. Who doesn't want to be in favor of choice, right? That sounds like a good thing. Versus anti-abortion. So one side is for something, that's great, it's positive. The other side is against something. They're against the woman's right to. They're against women's reproductive health, right? And this is how the media frames the debate. Why don't they say anti-baby versus pro-life? Pro-death versus pro-life. Well, that's kind of slanted, isn't it? But they'll never slant it that way. So they'll talk about it about women's bodily autonomy, women's health care. By the way, well over half of the babies killed by abortion are female. So don't tell me you really care about women if more than half of the ones being killed are female. So it's obviously it's a tragic situation. By the way, if I forget to say this later on, just make sure I say it here. And it is at the end of the talk, so just for some reason we don't get to it. Can God forgive somebody who has had an abortion? The answer is very clearly, absolutely, positively, yes. Okay, His grace is sufficient. So that is not it is not that somebody who's gone through it that has no hope. Of course they do. Okay, and even if you become convicted that what has happened, that person has murdered somebody, well, just remember that a large part of the Bible has been written by murderers. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, he killed somebody. David murdered Uriah indirectly, but he did that, and he wrote a lot of the Bible. Paul murdered Christians, and he wrote 13 books of the New Testament. So, yes, there is grace for that. So, let's take a look at this. We'll start from a biblical perspective. What does it mean to be made in God's image? And then we'll see what the Bible has to say about the life of the unborn. And then, while I'm talking, I'm going to actually fire up my other computer because the way this is set up, I can't look at my notes. I can only see exactly what you're seeing. And for one part of my talk, I need to see my notes. So I'm going to be looking at my other computer during that one. Sorry, I forgot to do that. I'm glad you guys are laid back enough for me to be unprofessional when I'm doing this. I'm going to type in this password wrong because it has to be like 87 letters and numbers. Alright. So, Genesis 1, 26 and 27, verse that we are pretty familiar with. In fact, we talked about it last night during, I think, one of the questions. God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. There have been some people who claim that, yes, just Adam and Eve were made in God's image, but once they fell, that image was pretty much erased. No, it wasn't. It was marred in the sense that we were broken and we're fallen, but it has not been erased. In Genesis 4, it talks about how Adam had a son in his likeness, and so some people say, well, see, Adam and Eve were made in God's likeness, but everybody since then has been made in man's likeness. No. Look at Genesis 9:6. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For the image of God he made man. Even after the flood, people are still made in God's image. How about in James 3, New Testament? With it, talking about the tongue, with it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness or the image of God. So all people that have ever existed or will ever exist are made in God's image. And because of that, you have limitless value. And therefore, life is sacred. That is the ultimate position of the pro-life side of things. It is not about, as we're going to see, it's not about controlling a woman's body. It is not about all these things the media tried to make it. It is because we believe every single human being, from the moment of fertilization, is made in God's image, and that life is valuable. That's why. Now, there might be some people who are part of the pro-life crowd who maybe don't always act that way. Maybe they get too fired up and they act as if their opponents aren't really made in God's image and they don't really treat them appropriately. So there are people who make mistakes, but ultimately this is at the core of the debate for us. Humans are distinct from animals because animals are not made in God's image. Therefore, all human beings have more value than any animal. Or a single human being has more value than all the animals. That may be uncomfortable for some people, especially dog lovers. Okay? But you know what's tragic in our culture today is there are a lot of people, when interviewed, if they were asked if they had a chance to save their neighbor that they didn't really like from a burning building or their dog from a burning building, most of them say their dog. That's messed up. Okay? We know the dog's already going to heaven, so don't worry about it. Okay? Your cat, well, there's no hope for it anyway. She's going to be like the cat, so it's already going to go to the other place. So if you save it, it's just delaying the inevitable. So this right there is the greatest distinction between man and the animals. This is one of the biggest problems of the whole theistic evolutionary view that man came from the ape-like ancestors. At what point, if that were the case, if God used an evolutionary process, which he didn't, but if he did, at what point do they really become human? When are they made in God's image? Or are apes made in God's image too? And in that case, every creature in that lineage of that whole evolutionary tree. So what's strange about the evolutionary view, a lot of times the activists, you would think they would at least think humans and animals have the same value, but what's really happened, a lot of times they elevate animals to be more important than humans. And you can see that among a lot of people, can't you? Just like Romans 1 talks about, they worship and serve the creature rather than the creator. So are humans alone made in God's image? Well, let me just throw this out here so that you're careful on how you say this. I think you can make a very strong case that angels are also made in God's image. Every time you think of an attribute used to describe the image of God, what does it mean to be made in God's image? You can apply the exact same thing to angels. You know, they're relational, yep. They can communicate, yep. They can communicate with God, yep. They are rational, yes. Okay, everything you can think of, they're creative, yes. Whatever you can think of that it might mean to be made in God's image also applies to the angels. There's some of them. Moral, they know right from wrong, yep. Dominion, rule over earth's living things. Man was given dominion over earth, and then you actually read in Deuteronomy 32 that there are certain angelic beings that were given dominion as well. So every attribute we can think of to define what it means to be made in God's image, angels also have that. So I think you can say, I think you can build a really good case for it. I'm not going to get into it here because it's not really the issue. All I'm wanting to point out is just a lot of times we say, we're the only thing made in God's image, and that's not necessarily true. Okay? The only part of this physical creation made in God's image, yes. some people have said, think of it more as a verb. We are to image God. We are imagers of God. So we image God. We reflect who God is to the world. And that's what we're supposed to be as Christians. So if you're struggling to figure out what it means to be made in God's image, think of it that way. As Christians, we're supposed to be reflecting who God is to the world. Okay? We are supposed to love those who are not really worthy of love, because that's what Jesus did. We're supposed to be modeling our lives after Him. We're reflecting who He is to the world. So all human beings have limitless value. We are special, and God loves all of us, not because of our own greatness, not because we can do a sport really well, or we can draw something amazing, or because we can do all these incredible things. Humans can do incredible things. But it's not anything that we've done. It's because we're made in His image. Therefore, all human life is valuable. And again, that's the ultimate reason why abortion is wrong, because it takes the life of somebody who is made in God's image. And we'll come back to that, because people will bring that back up and say, what about war? What about capital punishment? So we'll come back to that in a little bit. So what does the Bible actually teach about the unborn? Well, in Matthew 1:23, speaking of Jesus, behold, the virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which is translated God with us. The virgin shall be with what? Child. Okay. When did the Son of God take on human flesh? Not at the first Christmas that we celebrate. I'm not getting into the debate about when Christmas actually was. That's irrelevant right now. But that's when we typically celebrate it. Actually, He put on flesh 9 months earlier, roughly 9 months earlier, when the Holy Spirit overshadowed Mary and she conceived. At that moment, the moment that she was pregnant, that is when the Son of God, that's when the incarnation began. And not at Christmas, but about 9 months earlier. How about Exodus chapter 21? And this is an example, I think we're going to come back to this verse in a little bit, but this is an example that the people on the pro-abortion side will use to say, see, the Bible's okay with abortion, but here's what it says: that men fight and hurt a woman with child, a woman who is pregnant, so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows. He shall surely be punished accordingly as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. So if a pregnant woman, 70 months pregnant, is hit during this, and she delivers, but the baby's okay, the man gets fined. But if any harm follows, life for life. If the baby dies, the man dies. You see it? In other words, that unborn child has the exact same value as the person who's already walking around, the person who's already been born. That's what the Bible teaches. They have the same value. So the Mosaic Law treated the unborn with the same value as those already born. This is known as lex talionis, the law of retribution, life for life, eye for eye. And as I mentioned, sometimes people will use that as abortion advocates. We'll come back to that in a little bit. That's one of the objections. And there's one other one they use that's really weird, but they'll try to find anything. All right, so in Luke 1, this is talking about Elizabeth, who is the mother of John the Baptist. When she's pregnant with John the Baptist, and Mary comes to visit her, and Mary's pregnant with Jesus, Elizabeth, so it says, and it happened when Elizabeth heard the greeting of Mary, that the babe leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. Then she spoke out with a loud voice and said, blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. But why is this granted to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me? For indeed, as soon as the voice of your greeting sounded in my ears, the babe leaped in my womb for joy. That does not sound like a blob of tissue. It's a babe leaping in her womb, which, by the way, that is think about it, the unborn John the Baptist miraculously recognized the presence of God's Son. That's pretty cool. But the Greek word for babe there is brephos. It is the same word that is used in Luke 2 when the shepherds are told they're going to find a babe wrapped in swaddling cloths. A baby who has already been born, that baby, of course, is Jesus. It's the same word for the unborn that is for the born. They also brought the infants, there's brephos again, to him, and it's also used interchangeably with little children, which is the Greek paideia. In Acts 7:19, it talks about how they were exposed to their babies. This is Stephen talking about when Pharaoh commanded the Egyptians to kill all of the Israelite boys, making them expose their babies. So the same word, all of these ones that the unborn is referred to as the same term as those that have already been born. So the mother of my Lord, Mary was already the mother of Jesus before he was born. She didn't become his mother at birth. Okay, so I want to kick this while we're at it. Why do some of us say, I'm going to be a mother, or I'm going to be a father, or I'm going to be a grandfather, I'm going to be a grandmother? If the person's already pregnant, you already are a mom. You already are a dad, or a grandmother, or a grandfather. Okay? You already are. Don't say, well, in 4 months I'll be a grandpa. No, you are already. And that means that I already am. Why? Because a little over 2 years ago, 3 now, I think September will be 3 years. My daughter had an ectopic pregnancy, and they lost their baby. And so I already have one who's with the Lord. So when people ask me if I have any grandchildren, I say, yeah, one with the Lord. So I am a grandpa now. I have not seen my grandchild yet. Someday I will. I can't wait to see him or her. That'll be pretty cool. But just the little things we say, think about it. It plays into their hands when we talk like that. Because we're acting as if that child is not already there. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm not trying to be harsh toward it, but just think about how we talk about the baby. Sometimes we'll say it as well. I try really hard not to say it when we're talking about the child in the womb. He or she. You know, if you happen to know he or she, then say he or she. Don't say it because you're depersonalizing the baby. Make sense? Alright, there, I got that soapbox. But let's look at some indirect references to the biblical view of the unborn. In Jeremiah 1, verses 4 and 5, and some people have questioned me about why we didn't include this verse in the exhibit. Because this is one that they go to all the time. Well, look at what it says. The word Lord came to me, Jeremiah said this, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you. I ordained you a prophet to the nations. Well, how come I want to use that in the exhibit? Well, the verse is about God's omniscience. It's not necessarily about life in the womb. Look what it said. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. The point of that passage is that God knew Jeremiah long before Jeremiah came along. Okay? That he had been set apart as a prophet before Jeremiah was ever even conceived. And I don't think that we want to argue that Jeremiah existed prior to fertilization, do we? But that's what we would be making this verse say if we use this like a primary argument for life in the womb. The emphasis is on God's omniscience. Now, it does talk about him being formed in the womb, so that person is being formed in the womb. So we can use that indirectly, but that's not the main point of this passage. He said, before you were born, I sanctified you. So it's essentially making the same point as the previous one, because it's in what's called Hebrew parallelism. That's how a lot of poetic and prophetic literature is written in the Bible, in parallelism. So indirectly, it is a pro-life text, because it affirmed that it was the prophet who was in the womb. But that's not the point of the passage. Here's what's going on. Jeremiah makes the excuse, I'm too young. That's what he's claiming. But God takes away that excuse. Jeremiah's like, no, I'm too young. God says, don't say I'm a youth. For you shall go to all whom I send you, and whatever I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of their faces, for I am with you to deliver you, says the Lord. In other words, God says that he gives delivers. God has been waiting for Jeremiah, because he knew Jeremiah was the one who was going to be this prophet, who was going to have to announce some very, very hard things to the people of Jerusalem. Their city was about to be wiped out by the Babylonians. And Jeremiah was going to see it all. And he was going to suffer tremendously during that time as well. He writes Lamentations, that's why he's known as the weeping prophet. Jeremiah was going to be the one who was going to be doing some of the most difficult preaching that anybody's had to do. And God is saying, don't say to me you're too young. I've been waiting for you because you're the guy. That's the point of the passage. How about Isaiah 44:2? Some people have asked, how come you didn't use this verse in the exhibit? Well, thus says the Lord who made you and formed you from the womb, who will help you. That sounds good, right? What did we learn already in the last couple of nights? What are we supposed to do when we're interpreting? Look at the context. Okay? So what is the context here? Yet hear me now, O Jacob my servant, and Israel whom I have chosen. Thus says the Lord who made you, and formed you from the womb, who will help you. Fear not, O Jacob my servant, and you Jeshurun whom I have chosen. He's talking about the nation of Israel. So he's speaking metaphorically about forming him in the womb, forming that nation in the womb. God did make this nation of Israel. But that's what he's talking about. It's not talking about an individual woman who is going to give birth. Make sense? So we have to make sure we don't just pull verses out of context to proof text what we want to say, because the Bible, that's not what that verse is teaching. So, let's see. But it does talk about the womb as being when life begins. So in that sense, it's indirectly supporting the pro-life position, but that's really not the point of that passage. So when does life begin? Well, from the Bible, we've already seen that the child in the womb is just as valuable as the person outside the womb, because life begins at conception. So that's, I'm sorry, let me correct that. It is, ultimately, truly it is conception, but we have to be careful about using that word. Because in 20-some years ago now, they have changed the definition of conception to mean any time up until implantation. So conception can be up to 2 weeks now. So what we should be saying is, it's still hard to get over old habits. Fertilization. Okay? When sperm and egg come together, and the chromosomes are the genetic material from father and genetic material from mother come together, and you get that unique DNA signature for the first time of a different person. That is the moment of fertilization. So from a cultural perspective, when does life begin? Well, sometimes I'll argue that it's at the first heartbeat, which is sometime around the 3rd week. Talking embryonic age, so from the beginning at the moment of fertilization versus what usually is talking about pregnancy is the gestational age, which is about 2 weeks more than the actual age, because it'll go back to the time of the woman's last menstrual period. So then they calculate from there. Sometimes they'll say, well, when the fetus feels pain, that's when life begins, or when personhood begins. Well, when does personhood begin? Who gets to determine that? Sometimes 3rd trimester. Well, if it's 3rd trimester, we got some problems. I want to tell you about Lila. There she is. This little girl, I know the picture's not the clearest thing up there, but see the picture on the top? When she was born, Lila weighed less than 1 pound. She was born at 19 weeks and 4 days. So just about halfway through pregnancy, what you normally want for a full term. And so when she was born, 14 ounces I think she was. And that picture, see around her right arm? That's her mom and dad's wedding rings. That's how tiny she was. There's Lila when she was 4 years old. There's Lila at the exhibit in the Creation Museum right before we opened the exhibit, and her mom taking a picture of her in front of her little story about Lila, and I'm taking a picture of her mom taking a picture of Lila. And sometimes you just have to suffer for the Lord, so I got to do one whole day taking Lila and her family around the Creation Museum and giving them a tour and showing them the exhibit, and then the next day, darn, I just had to take them through the ark for the whole day and everything, and spend time with them. And she was really cool. I think she's about 8 years old now. I think her birthday would have been just last week, and I think she's 8 now. But, so you want to tell me she wasn't a person when she was born? Because she hadn't reached 3rd trimester yet? How can you look at this little girl and say she doesn't really deserve to live? Because she wasn't far enough along. So, is it at the first breath? Is it several hours or days after birth? Is it what some places they're trying to pass, Maryland and California both have laws in process right now that would talk about the prenatal stage, or actually perinatal stage. What is that? Around birth. When is that? Depends on who's defining it. It can be up to 5 to 6 weeks after birth. Yeah, Maryland and California right now are debating this. The parents should be able to abort children anywhere up to 5 to 6 weeks after they are born. You want to tell me it has something to do with the woman's right to choose? Is that really what it's about in this case? Not at all. It's a spiritual darkness is what's come over the minds of some of these people. And I'm not saying every single person on the pro-abortion side would be in favor of that. Okay, that's not. I'm not trying to paint them all with one big broad brush. But the people who are pushing that sort of idea, that last one especially, are absolutely sick. But before we get too upset about that, how is it different than doing it to the child who's in the womb? It's not, is it? All right, so from a scientific perspective, there is really only one place that life, one point along that continuum that life could begin, and that is fertilization. That's when you have a unique individual formed at fertilization, when the DNA, half the DNA from mom and half the DNA from dad come together. That's when you have a unique individual. And again, I mentioned don't say conception. That's what we used to call conception. But now they have changed that to be anywhere up through the first 6 to 14 days up to implantation in the womb. Okay, so the embryo, the fertilized egg, will move down the fallopian tube, and usually by about day 6 will come into contact with the uterine wall, but by the time it moves through, passes through and implants, that can be up to 2 weeks. So they'll say anything up to there is conception. That's why the morning after pill and other things, they'll say that's not an abortion, because it's ending things before, quote unquote, conception, before this end of the second week. So it is an abortion. It's not preventing the person from being pregnant. It's preventing the baby to continue to live. So here's one unique instance. Identical twins initially do have identical DNA. But minor genetic variations arise to factors related to DNA replication during their lifetime. A lot of times they'll have, as far as you can tell, identical DNA with their fingerprints. They'll just have, there'll be little tiny differences. Sometimes it's because of the DNA replication, they can just get a little tiny bit different. So they're not completely identical, but they started off that way. You can make a logical case for the biblical view without even using the Bible. That's something that Scott Klusendorf has done for a long time. He talks about what he calls the SLED argument, the acronym there, size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency. For example, does size determine personhood? What do you think? You guys are allowed to respond here, okay? So yes or no. Does size determine personhood?
No.
No, because if it did, I would be more of a person than any one of you, because I'm bigger than you. But that's absurd, isn't it? We don't look at the size of a person. Well, that person, they have more right to live than this person who's a little bit smaller than them. That's absurd. Okay, how about the level of development? A 10-year-old who has not gone through puberty yet, are they less of a person than a 20-year-old who has? Okay. So now let's look at that situation. How about would they be more of a person than the child who has just been born? No. How about than the child who is about to be born in 10 minutes? No. Okay. There's just a different level of development there. And the same thing with the size argument. How about environment? So do we look at somebody's environment and say, well, they're more of a person than this other one? Is that the right way to look at it? Okay, these people live in Wisconsin, they're obviously more valuable than Minnesota. Oh, well, that's true. There's no question, I think that's in 3 Timothy. Whenever I want to add something to the Bible jokingly, that's 3 Timothy. Just so you know, I'm not being serious when I say that. But we know that the environment does not determine personhood. Okay, so why would the child in the womb who's in a different environment be less of a person than the child who moves about a foot down the birth canal and is now born? What happened magically that they now become a person? Or if Maryland and California have their way, they're not actually a person yet for another 5 or 6 weeks. What happens? When does personhood begin? There's only one place that we can make a logical case for it, and that is all the way back at fertilization. Does degree of dependency determine personhood? Well, they can't survive on their own. Yeah, neither can a 1-year-old. And sometimes neither can a 99-year-old. And sometimes neither can a 40-year-old, depending on the situation. And almost every single teenage boy. Amen? Sorry. I said almost every single one. But those things do not determine personhood. And yet, these are the things that ultimately what our culture is using to try to say this is why abortion should be illegal. It really boils down to those things. So let me show you what the Fearfully and Wonderfully Made exhibit looks like. I think this might work. I've got a video here. This is the area that you walk in. And we don't have audio, so you can't hear the score that my friend Ben did for us. But there's some of the things we've been talking about. Pretty soon you're going to see the baby models that people I work with made these models. Because they looked on the market, they couldn't find anything that would work for us. They weren't good enough, so they decided to make their own. And they are so lifelike that we have had to instruct our museum workers that, yes, there's a lot of we've had to instruct our museum workers that to remind guests that no, those are not real babies on display, they're models that were made. So that's the tour of our current exhibit. Ends of the gospel right there. So that is going to be essentially the same flow of the updated exhibit, but there's going to be more material. It's about double the size. It won't be double the content, but maybe about 1.5 times the content. So what I want to do, and because it's been a while since I pressed the computer, actually went back to sleep on me, so let me do this. I want to walk you through what happens at each of these various stages, and because I am not smart enough to remember all of that, I'm going to read my notes. Alright, so obviously this is showing the moment of fertilization, and we've already talked about that when DNA from the father and the DNA from the mother combine. At the single cell at that point is referred to as a zygote, and it's already a unique human being made in God's image at that point. The cell then divides into 2 cells and is now referred to as an embryo, and the embryo continues to move along the fallopian tube, which we saw a picture of that a little bit ago, all the way to the uterus. And so by day 6, that's usually when implantation begins. And then by day 14, the embryo is generally firmly implanted in the uterine wall and starts to grow rapidly. So then, by about day 22, that's what we look like. A little bit weird, but what you're seeing form there is the brain and the nervous system has been forming for several days, and the heart starts to beat actually by day 22. You might have seen billboards say by like day 35. It's because they're using, again, the gestational age, which is adding 2 weeks. And that's not how long the baby's actually been alive. The baby's actually, they've actually only been a baby there for 22 days. So heart beats much earlier than what a lot of people think. So then, by 24 days, the heart continues to grow, which causes a bulge in the baby's midsection, and the structures that make up the eyes and ears have just started to form. And then, by 28 days, so 4 weeks, that's what we look like. You can see where the heart is, and you can see that the head is starting to form, and then they have, the reason we use this age is there are little folds that look like they're in the neck, and for a long time the evolutionists have used that as proof of an evolutionary idea known as embryonic recapitulation, or ontogeny recapitulate phylogeny was their technical term for it. It was made up in the 1800s by a guy named Ernst Haeckel, who made a bunch of drawings from memory, in other words, he faked them, where he's comparing the embryos of different animals to the embryos of humans and saying, look, they're almost identical. Well, yeah, he's faking a bunch of the drawings. And what he was arguing is that as a human forms in the womb, they go through the evolutionary stages. So there's a time where you're going through like a fish stage, and right here they would call these gill slits. So obviously not human. I mean, if you can kill a fish, you can kill this, no problem. By the way, in our textbooks today, biology textbooks, they are still called gill slits. They are not gills. They have nothing to do with breathing or gills, nothing like that at all. They are things that develop into the muscles and bones and glands in the head and neck area. We know what they develop into. They have nothing to do with gills. Because we don't ever go through a fish stage or an amphibian stage or anything like that. We are always in the human stage. But that's what Ernst Haeckel did, and how many millions of babies have been killed because of his lies. Not just in the US, he was in Germany. And he was pushing Darwinian evolution. So by day 40, you can already see the eyes right there. And at this point, it's interesting, the eyelids are not fused together yet, but they will become fused together for a little while before they actually open up again. And then the ears continue forming, the hands, arms, feet, and legs are pretty easy to discern. I mean, of course, they're not fully grown or anything, but you can tell exactly where they are. By week 8, when we look like that, by the way, this is the first one in the exhibit that is actual size. The rest of them, it looks like they have a magnifying glass over them. Those are expanded, so you can see. This is the first one that's actual size. By 9 weeks of life, you are about, not even quite 2 inches long, and you weigh less than 1/4 ounce. So not very big. Hey! Okay, well, too late now. All right. By 9 weeks, the basic structure of the central nervous system, the brain and everything and vital organs have already been established. And now at this point is when when the baby is generally referred to as a fetus. Okay? Just Latin word for baby, but sometimes because we don't know the term, it can kind of dehumanize the baby, so some people don't like using the term fetus at all. I just say baby from day 1. That's generally how I talk about it. By week 10, she is, we did a little baby girl in the exhibit. The reason that we didn't want to have a bunch of little girls that like 5 or 6 years old asking Mom and Dad, what's that? By the time they get done, just created an awkward situation for Mom and Dad, so we made a little girl in here. So by week 10, she's about 2.5 inches from crown to rump and weighs less than an ounce. Fingernails are growing in. The face looks much more like that of a baby who's already been born. I mean, because things are forming into place. So by 11 weeks of life, baby's fingers begin moving independently, and fingerprints have appeared. And here's a really cool thing for baby girls. Their tiny, tiny, tiny little ovaries already have all the eggs she will ever produce. Interesting. By that point, the placenta has developed all the necessary structures to supply the baby's nourishment. Prior to that, the baby was basically surviving, getting the material and everything from the yolk sac that had started to form. And then, at this point, the placenta kind of takes over and becomes like most of the organs for the baby for the next several months. And then once the baby's born, there's no placenta anymore, you don't need it. It's like this crazy super organ that God designed, super complicated, and just need it for a few months, 6 months or so, and then we're done. So it's pretty interesting. At this point, she can use her facial muscles and even start sucking her thumb. By week 13, her eyelids are fused, and she can sense bright light, so she'll turn away from bright light. By week 14, start to develop fine, soft, unpigmented hair called lanugo, which grows from hair follicles. And here's another thing, no more hair follicles are ever produced after birth. So those present at birth form all the hairs that a person will ever have in their lifetime. And I know it's not that impressive in my case. So by week 15, the baby hairline grows on the head. She can now move her joints, and the soft cartilage of her skeleton begins to harden and be replaced by bone. The baby by week 17, since they're developing, may be able to hear sound beyond the womb. And At 18 weeks, the baby tastes and swallows amniotic fluid, and digestive system begins functioning. At week 19, the baby's skin is really fragile. It's coated with a white layer of shed skin cells and oil called vernix, which protects her from the amniotic fluid. And at this point, is about halfway through her time inside of mom. And that's when she can really about start kicking and stretching, and that's when mom starts to feel that pretty prominently. So that is about how old Lila was, how big she was when she was born. But again, according to a lot of these people in favor of abortion, she should have been perfectly fine to kill her because she wasn't really a person yet. Week 21, her skin is still translucent, and she's rather thin, but big changes are coming because from this point, everything's in place. And now you just got to start growing, just start getting bigger. So by week 23, fat starts filling out, and her skin and her colored hair starts to grow on her head. The baby starts to breathe amniotic fluid, just kind of practicing, making sure the lungs are working, even though I'm not breathing in oxygen yet. By 25 weeks, the baby's brain is very active and has generally a consistent sleep schedule. By 26 weeks, she can start blinking, and her eyesight continues to improve. Eyelashes have grown in. By week 30, each of her systems in place, the baby grows very rapidly, about half a pound every single week until birth. So by week 33, baby's pupils dilate or contract in response to light, and her kidneys are fully developed. By week 34, the lanugo hair that covered the baby's body is almost gone, but that vernix that covered her body usually remains until shortly after birth. And a lot of people think that the vernix lubricates the birth process and keeps the baby warm for the first few hours after birth. That's the general thinking on what that's for. By week 36, the lungs and brain fully mature in the final weeks before birth, and her eye color is filling in. Although if she is born with blue eyes, they might change to a darker color in her first year. Anybody have that happen, or have a child that that happen to? Born with blue and they actually become darker? Okay, so it can happen. There's 38 weeks. And 38 weeks, really from weeks 37 to 41, full term. And in preparation for the big move, she's already been upside down for quite some time, just being ready to be born. So, some pretty cool things about that. When we think about the changes that have to take place in the baby at the moment, in the first couple seconds before and after being born. If these things did not happen for the baby, and if they did not happen for the mom, neither one survived. So if you want to come at this from an evolutionary perspective, you have to make sure all of this happens just right the first time, or else goodbye people. Okay? For the baby, prior to the birth, placenta, for the last 6 months or so, essentially functioned as the lungs, liver, GI tract, kidneys, and much more. But in the first few moments after birth, all of that has to change. Imagine bringing your lungs, liver, GI tract, kidneys, and other organs all online, all at the first breath. How are you going to make that work? Pretty complicated. Baby spent her first 9 months in fluid, so the blood and lymph system remove fluid from the lungs and replace it with oxygen, which allowed her to take her first breath. During, I think I might have, no, I don't have to. We're going to have a video in the YouTube of an animation that shows this, because it's going to be a little complicated. I'm just talking about it, you're not familiar with it. But during development, the blood bypassed the lungs, and it took a shortcut in the heart. There was like a little one-way valve in the heart, or sometimes you've heard of babies being born with a hole in the heart. What happens if for some reason that valve doesn't close properly? Okay? But in most cases, that valve shuts right after the first breath, and the blood doesn't go that way anymore. And so that shortcut closes, and there was another thing that is now, we each have this, is now a ligament, but before it was actually an artery. I think it's called the ductus arteriosus. Now it's ductus ligamentum. And what happens is, as soon as we are born, the blood no longer has to do that in order to bypass the lungs, so it just starts to shrivel and become a ligament. Who told it to do that? If it wasn't there, the baby could not survive in the womb. If the other process didn't happen, the baby could not survive. If those things didn't shut off at at birth, you can't fill the lungs with air. You can't get the blood oxygenated to carry the rest of the body. You're going to suffocate. All of that has to happen all at once. It's miraculous, is what it is. How about in the mom? Well, to prepare for birth, the mother's three different joints in the pelvis loosen, which causes the opening to expand. That's what when we talk about dilation, that's what is going on there. So the baby can pass through. If they didn't just loosen, but actually came apart, mom would never ever walk again, would never stand again. But God did it in such a way that they could loosen and then come back together. When the placenta detaches from the mother's uterus, it leaves what would normally be the largest wound any person would ever receive. Because that huge placenta basically rips off from the uterine wall, which leaves a giant wound. But what happens is all of the blood vessels that are attached to that, all of them have like this little tiny sphincter muscle that are around them, and they all just pinch right off. So she loses about a cup of blood rather than bleeding out completely in 10 minutes. That's how big the wound would be. She would lose every single ounce of blood in 10 minutes if it kept on going. But because God has designed this so miraculously, as soon as that detaches, okay, all these muscles fired, cinch off all those things. Man, we're lucky evolution got that right the first time, aren't we? Isn't it absurd to think that this just all happened by chance? It's incredible what God has done. All right, well, let's go through some of the arguments that people use for abortion. And we're not going to cover every single one, and I'm not going to hammer all these things. What I want to do is just give you like the right perspective on addressing these. So a lot of people hear like, oh, the fetus is just a clump of cells. Look, we know that that's completely false. Modern medical advancement, we can look inside the womb, we can see what's happening there. We know that this is not a clump of cells. We know this is a human child who's developing. Anybody who's honest or has any sort of knowledge about this all knows that's exactly what's going on, not just a clump of cells. Unless you want to say each one of us are just a clump of cells, which in one sense, that we are clumps of cells, but we're so much more than that. We're clumps of cells that happen to be made in God's image, just like the baby in the womb. How about the my body, my choice argument? We've heard this a lot, right? We heard this a lot in the last 3 weeks since Roe v. Wade was struck down? Absolutely. The problem with it is, you're not talking about aborting your body. You're talking about doing something with somebody else's body. If you want to say that the baby in the womb is the mom's body, well, that creates some problems. That would mean mom has 2 heads, 4 arms, 4 legs. And when the baby is going to be a boy, that means mom has both male and female parts. See the problem? Obviously, it's not the mom's body. This is a child growing inside of the mom's body. So they're not talking about aborting their own body, they're talking about aborting somebody else's body. So what if the pregnancy is from rape or incest, or what if it threatens the life of the mother? These can be tragic situations. They can be very difficult situations. In the case of rape, I've got a very simple solution. Don't punish the child. Okay, if somebody needs to be punished, how about the rapist? Okay, now I know that's still difficult. What if it's a 12-year-old girl? Okay, I'm still not ever in favor of taking the life of the baby, but at the same time, I can understand why some people can argue in like extreme cases that maybe they would make allowance for certain things. So I can understand why they might. I'm not comfortable doing that because I don't think killing the baby is the right solution. But again, don't use the most extreme scenario to try to justify every single one of them. Because if you ask somebody who's in favor of abortion, okay, what if we were to say, yes, life of the mother, it's allowed. Yes, rape and incest, it's allowed. Would they be okay with that? No, they want it anytime for any reason. That's not really their argument. They're just using it to try to say, make you feel emotional about it. Okay? My wife was extremely sick throughout the entire pregnancy, both times, both our kids. And she lost about 20 pounds with our first child by about she was about 4 or 5 months pregnant. You're usually supposed to gain weight. And a lot of you know who my wife is. She doesn't have a lot of weight to lose. And she was extremely sick. We talked about this and what would happen if her life were in danger. And she said, then I still go through with this and we have the baby, and if I happen to die, then I die. That's what she had decided. So anyways, but don't use extreme situations and justify all the cases. This might be the most absurd one. We hear this a lot. The baby's going to be poor, the baby will be disabled, or they're not going to be happy. How do you know? Are you saying poor people can't be happy? Are you saying that your value comes from your socioeconomic status? That's what they're claiming, isn't it? Since when are we like India with the caste system? That you have the undesirables, the untouchables, and then the people who are much higher and they're not even allowed to interact with them. Since when did that become our value system? That's kind of what they're doing. It's coming from a very different worldview. That's why so many babies with Down syndrome are being killed now. 2/3 of them in the United States are aborted. They do this testing before birth, around 11 weeks, and that test is not very accurate. If it comes back with certain markers, then they will do another test at about 19 weeks, which is much more accurate, but also very dangerous. They told my sister that first test came back like positive, or like that her child may very well have Down syndrome, so they were encouraging her to have an abortion. And she said, even if the child has Down syndrome, there's no way in the world we're going to do an abortion. And I love that child just the same. Well, by the way, the child just finished her second year of college at University of Minnesota. Perfect, but she did not have Down syndrome, but even if she did, we would love her the same. And I think parents, I have friends who have children with Down syndrome, and I think you guys know people who do as well. Is that child worth having around? Are they a blessing to their family? Absolutely, many times in more ways than most people would ever imagine. So this is one that's so absurd. Well, they're all absurd, but pro-lifers just want to control women's bodies. It has nothing to do with that. It's not about that at all. And if that's the case, then we can just say, well, pro-aborts just want to control the baby's body. We can play the same game. But many pro-lifers are women. Women that are pro-life in this room, stop trying to control women's bodies. It's not about that. It's about the human being made in God's image. So it has everything to do with the sanctity of life. Pro-lifers only care about the fetus. They don't care what happens after the baby is born. It's hogwash. That is so false. A huge percentage of people who adopt children are pro-life. And there are thousands and thousands of people waiting to adopt a baby. My daughter and her husband have been raising money for years to try to save up to adopt a child, and yet the hurdles you have to jump over in order to adopt a baby are extreme in our culture. They make it so difficult to do it. They've done all sorts of fundraisers and everything, and now even when they have enough, it's taken over 2 years. They're just trying to find a match, and they're not able to find they're not being paired with anybody. So don't act as if it's just a super easy thing. And how is it an argument for abortion? It's not at all. It's just attacking pro-lifers. It doesn't in any way make a case that abortion should be illegal or anything. It's just going to attack the motive or the behavior of people who are pro-life. And yet, we know the people who donate to charities, especially for young people, are often pro-life. That's why we have crisis pregnancy centers all over the United States that have popped up. Because these are people who care about the baby, not only just while they're in the womb, but also right afterwards. Some people say, well, you can't be pro-life and be for the death penalty. Okay, well, without getting into whether or not the death penalty should be the right thing or not, you can't compare the two. It's apples and oranges. It's apples and rotten oranges is what it is. Because what you're talking about is killing the most innocent of people among us, the children who have done nothing wrong, have not had an opportunity to do something wrong, versus people who are often violent criminals. Now, are there times in our justice system where perhaps an innocent person is condemned? Yeah, probably happens. It's rare, but we're not perfect. And so you can try to make arguments for or against the death penalty, but you can't say it's the same thing as abortion. Because the person who had murdered others has essentially given up their right to live. If you live in a state where murder is penalized by capital punishment, you have forfeited your life by doing that. It's something you have done. In the case of abortion, you haven't done anything, but somebody else is deciding to take your life. They're not the same thing. Not even close. All right, so let's take a look at two passages that the pro-abortion side will use to, from the Bible, try to say that the Bible is okay with abortion. The first one we already looked at earlier. If men fight and hurt a woman with a child so that she gives birth prematurely and no harm follows, he shall surely be punished accordingly as the woman's husband imposes on him. And he shall pay as the judge has determined. We've already talked about this, right? So if she gives birth prematurely, but the baby's fine, okay, well, the man pays a fine for doing it. Something happens to the baby, eye for eye, life for life, wound for wound. Okay, that baby is just as valuable as the person who's already been born. So how is that an argument for abortion? Well, it's not when you use the New King James Version or most Bibles. It might possibly be if you use the NRSV or the RSV. Because look what it says. When people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there is a miscarriage, not give birth prematurely, but the baby dies. Now look what it says. Read it with that in mind. So that the baby dies, there is a miscarriage, yet no further harm follows to whom? You can't harm the baby anymore, the baby's already dead. So no further harm follows to mom. The one responsible should be fined what the judge has determined, what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judge has determined. If any harm follows, to whom? The woman. Then it's life for life, eye for eye. So if mom gets hurt, then that's when the person is punished. But for the baby, big deal, it's a fine. Do you see how mistranslating one word changes all of this? And by the way, that is a mistranslation. So, by the way, it still is not an argument for abortion, because even if miscarriage were the correct translation, which it's not, the passage is not about the intentional killing of a baby. The mom was not trying to do that. Okay, so it's not even the same scenario. But the Hebrew literally means her children come out. It is not miscarriage. It's so that the baby is born. So if something happens so that the child is born, is what's happening. The NRSV is completely inconsistent on this. Okay? And does it help you to understand that the RSV and the NRSV are often considered to be very liberal translations that are used by liberal churches? Now you understand why. Because on social issues, they are very left of center on many things. And their translation reflects it. So in the same word, it translates premature birth this way. Give birth before the midwives come. It's the same word, and it talks about it as premature birth, which is exactly what's being used in Exodus 20, the other passage we just looked at. So how come in Exodus 1, the Hebrew midwives are talking, about not killing the baby boys? They give birth before the midwives get there. So 2 chapters later, Exodus 23, it translates a different Hebrew word as miscarriage. No one will suffer miscarriage or be married to a new man, because it's a different word. Hebrew has a word for miscarriage, and it's not used in Exodus 21. So why did the RSV and NRSV use miscarriage? Because they wanted to allow for something like abortion. Now maybe that's not why, but I can't see any other reason why they'd be completely inconsistent in the same book. So it refers to premature birth, not miscarriage. If the child is unharmed, then the man gets fined. If the child is harmed, eye for eye, limb for limb, that is not an argument for abortion. That is the exact opposite. It means the child in the womb is just as valuable as the person outside the womb. You see that? All right, ready for the other one? This is a weird one. Numbers 5. If a man becomes suspicious of his wife being unfaithful, he could bring her to the priest for a ritual that seemed really strange in our day. Okay? This has been the case where nobody witnessed her cheating on her husband. Because if there were witnesses, what happens to her and to the guy? They're stoned. Okay, so we know what happens in that case. So in this case, the husband brings the wife that he suspects of adultery to the priest, and they are going to write down these words of this oath that she's going to swear, and then they're going to scrape them off into this cup of water, or into this cup, and she has to drink this as she makes this oath. It seems really strange, but then the priest shall put the woman under the oath of the curse, and he shall say to the woman, "The Lord make you a curse and an oath among your people, when the Lord makes your thigh rot and your belly swell, and may this water that causes the curse go into your stomach and make your belly swell and your thigh rot." Then the woman shall say, "Amen, so be it." Seems really weird, right? So, let's see. All right, and in the NIV, so there's Numbers 5, 21, 22 in the NIV. So your thigh rot, in this version, here it says that your womb miscarries. Okay? So there's debate about how this should be translated, and this is one of the real struggles with translation, because sometimes an idiom or a figure of speech is being used. So for example, when the Bible talks about God being long-suffering, do you know what it actually is saying in Hebrew? God has a long nose. That's what the Hebrew really says. God has a long nose, and we translate it as long-suffering. Why? It's talking about patience, because if you have a short nose and you get punched in the nose, it turns red right away. If you have a long nose and you get punched in the nose, it takes a while before it turns red. That's the idea. And so it's a figure of speech that gets translated appropriately so we understand what it means. When it says your thigh rot and your belly swell, is that actually talking about being disfigured, or is it talking about you're going to miscarry, like this baby's going to not survive, kind of like David's child with Bathsheba, that first one's going to be born and die right afterwards, so within 7 days. Is that what it's talking about here? Well, so there's debate about that. So is it that she can no longer have children, which would be that she would be a disgrace then among her own people, that she can't have kids, and because of something that she had done. So a lot of the translations favor that it's an idiom or a lot of translations favor the disfigurement, but the other ones, a lot of commentaries will say, but it's also an idiom for miscarriage. However that should be, it does not support abortion, the whole view. Because in this case, even if there's a miscarriage, whose fault is it? Whose fault is it?
No.
The woman who lies before God, under oath. Okay, first of all, she had an affair, so it's the guy she's having an affair with and her who are at fault. And then she's the one who's brought before the judge, or before the priest, and she swears an oath before God saying she was faithful. And if she wasn't, this is what happens. She's responsible. Just like when Achan, who steals the stuff from Jericho after they conquer Jericho, and then they go up to Ai and they get defeated, and ultimately they find out, well, it's because Achan sinned and he stole this stuff. Achan isn't the only one who pays the price. His whole family is killed. And all his belongings, like his animals, everything, all of it's wiped out. So there are times where children suffer because of the sins of fathers and mothers, right? Even today that happens. So this is not about abortion in any way, shape, or form. Even if it's the miscarriage case, it's the result of the mom lying in her oath before God. And as a result, the baby dies. It's her fault. By the way, we never see a single example of this ever carried out in Scripture, but it almost did, in the most famous pregnancy of all time. Remember? After his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. And Joseph, her husband, being a just man and not wanting to make her a public example, was minded to put her away secretly. What would he have to do in this case? Because she's pregnant, he knows it's not from him. So he suspects that she has been unfaithful. He does not suspect the Holy Spirit overshadowed her and she miraculously conceived, right? Who would think that? Until the angel comes along and tells him that. But that's not his first thought. His first thought is, oh no, Mary's got to go through that. and it's a public example. She's going to be seen. I don't want that to happen. I want to put her away secretly. He's a just man. He's a good man. And so that is what Mary would have been facing. But of course, the angel came along. Come on, just don't worry about it. This is what's happening. All right, so let's wrap things up with some hope and forgiveness. Will unborn babies who die be with the Lord? Well, you already know my position. I've already told you that I think I'm going to see my grandchild. And I think nearly every Christian would want to say yes. And most Christians do say yes. There's not one specific verse that comes right out and says those words exactly. We see in Psalm 106 that the children that were sacrificed to pagan gods were called innocent. Okay? I think you also see it in Jeremiah. David, his son who died at 7 days old, his first son, Bathsheba, David believed that he would see his son again. Now he says that I can come. I can go to him, but he can't come to me. Now maybe. So I don't want to use that as like a knockdown, drag out argument, because David might have just been saying, I'm going to go to the grave too, but he can't come back to the grave. There's a possibility that's what he had in mind. But in Mark 10, Jesus talked about how to let the little children come. He talks about the strange thing about how their angels never cease to see the face of God in heaven, which some people think is like this guardian angel thing. It's a really strange verse, but it tells you something. There's something significant about children and God's view of them. And we're not quite sure how to interpret that. But here, to me, the strongest passage is in Revelation 20, verse 13, at this great white throne judgment. So this final judgment, all of the people who are going to be sentenced to the lake of fire for all eternity are the ones who are at this judgment. They are judged according to their works, the things that they did, and that's what lands them in the lake of fire. How could unborn children be there? They've never done anything. They haven't committed works that they can be judged for. Now you can say they have a sin nature, that's true. We die because of that sin nature that we inherit from Adam. We are not judged eternally because of what Adam did. Adam's sin brought physical death to this world. We die because of what he did. But we are condemned for what we do or don't do, because essentially don't receive the gospel. Okay? And I like what Abraham says when he's pleading with God about the people of Sodom. 50 people, 45, 40, 30, all those things. At one point he says, will not the judge of the earth do what is right? He will. And we can have confidence that God will do what is right. And I think most of us believe that what is right is that unborn children will die and go to be with the Lord. And I think most of us would say the same thing is true for children, for young children who have already been born. And I think many of us would believe the same thing would be true for people who have some sort of mental disability that prevents them from ever understanding, comprehending right from wrong, or their need for a savior. They never mature to a certain level mentally. I think a lot of us would agree that that applies the same in all these situations. But what we can do is we can rest in the fact that the judge of the whole earth will do what's right. Is God willing to forgive somebody who has had an abortion? Yes, absolutely. I covered this earlier, but I didn't know if I would get to it by the time we were out of time. We know that he offers forgiveness for people who have done horrendous things. Okay? And I don't even want to, even though the end result might be the same, where Moses kills somebody, Paul kills Christians, I don't want to say that what these grown men did is the exact same, that they're just as blameworthy as a 13-year-old girl who's being pressured by her parents to go and do this. Even though the end result is the loss of a human life, I think some people would be more blameworthy in those situations than that 13-year-old girl. Does that make sense? But in any case, no matter what the sin, forgiveness and eternal life is offered to all who believe in Jesus Christ. And abortion is not the unforgivable sin. Blasphemy of the Holy Spirit is the unforgivable sin, according to Matthew 12. So, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new, for he made him, Christ, who knew no sin, to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So yes, forgiveness is available for those of us who have sinned, even for women who have sinned, or men who have pressured a woman to go and do that, or maybe their daughter to go and do something like that. Forgiveness is available. didn't say, oh, except for these sins. Okay? So, I think I saw some people line up. I'm not sure if they're completely done out there. You guys know if they're done back there? Or if they're ready to come in?
Quick question.
I don't have a mountain of kids back there.
Quick question. Yesterday we talked about some illegitimate children that became, I believe, enemies of the
question.
Oh,
Israelites.
Yeah, so we were talking about Canaan and then
Right.
Moab and Ammon.
Right.
Yes.
So, what about incest? Would incest be potentially considered? I know, I'm sure I know what your stance is, but would incest
Be permissible in that situation?
Correct.
Yeah, and one thing I wish I would have said last night when we were talking about Canaan is that even though Canaan gets cursed, it does not mean that God hated that child. It doesn't mean that that child had no chance whatsoever to be saved or anything. It's just that ultimately that line is going to become something that is not very good. So I wanted to clarify that from last night. I didn't say that, or at least I didn't make that clear. But I think a lot of times incest is handled under the same, when people are in the modern debate, they're handling it under the same situation of what happens with rape. Is abortion permissible in that case? So let's say rape or incest. But from a biblical perspective, we have to be careful on this. Who did Abraham marry? Sarah, who was his half-sister. Isaac married Rebecca, who was his cousin. Early on, Cain and Abel were married sisters. Right? So we could throw that, use that term incest there, but at some point along the line, I think because of genetic reasons, when the Israelites are going to the land, when the law is given, that's when God says no more close hair marriage. So I don't think that the child is ever to blame in that case, or ever unworthy or anything like that. I don't think that's a problem. It's just that there are a much greater chance of genetic abnormalities that can take place. So, all right, well, they are definitely lining up now. So, good question.